This is a shocking tale of love, deception, and murder. Naomi Carter had always believed she was living the dream. She had a stable marriage, 2 beautiful children, and a mother who had been her unwavering pillar of support. On the surface, everything about her life appeared perfect. Weekend barbecues with neighbors, family game nights, and vacations filled with laughter. But in reality, this perfection was an illusion, a fragile mask that hid the secrets and lies waiting to be uncovered. Naomi grew up in a modest home in Atlanta, Georgia, raised solely by her mother, Patricia Williams. Patricia had worked multiple jobs to provide Naomi with the best life possible, ensuring she had every opportunity to succeed. She was not just a mother to Naomi. She was her best friend, her confidant. No one could ever doubt the depth of their bond, built over years of struggle and triumph. Patricia was everything Naomi aspired to be: strong, independent, and endlessly caring. When Naomi met Daniel Carter, she felt as though she had found the missing piece to her puzzle. He was charming, intelligent, and ambitious, an up-and-coming architect known for his creative designs and sharp business acumen. Their love story was straight out of a romance novel. Love at first sight, whirlwind courtship, and a wedding that felt like a fairy tale. Daniel was not just a devoted husband. He was an exceptional father. He was the kind of man who would leave work early just to attend a school recital or stay up all night comforting a sick child. Life, it seemed, had given Naomi everything she had ever wanted. But perfection is often a dangerous illusion, and the truth, when it finally revealed itself, would prove to be more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. The day it all began was no different from any other. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the golden leaves swirling in the breeze as Naomi prepared the kids for their weekend visit to their grandparents' house. The plan was simple. Patricia would pick up the children for a fun-filled weekend, while Naomi and Daniel enjoyed some much-needed time alone. Naomi had been feeling disconnected lately. The demands of work, parenting, and maintaining a household had left her exhausted. She was hoping that this weekend would rekindle the spark in her marriage. She had even planned a surprise dinner for Daniel, his favorite steak with roasted garlic mashed potatoes and a bottle of vintage wine she had been saving for a special occasion. As she packed the children's overnight bags, she heard the familiar honk of Patricia's car in the driveway. Smiling, she hurried the kids outside, hugging them tightly before watching them hop into the back seat of her mother's sedan. "I'll call you before bed," Patricia promised, leaning in to kiss Naomi on the cheek. Naomi nodded, grateful as always. "Thank you, Mom. Love you. Love you too, sweetheart." Naomi watched them drive away, unaware that this would be the last time she would see her mother alive. Later that evening, Naomi was tidying up the house when she decided to retrieve some old photo albums from the attic. She wanted to reminisce, to relive the beautiful moments she had shared with Daniel before life had become so hectic. The attic was rarely used, filled with old boxes of forgotten memories. As she sifted through the dust-covered albums, her hand brushed against a small wooden chest she didn't recognize. Curiosity piqued. She pulled it out and opened it, revealing a bundle of old letters neatly tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was fragile, the ink slightly smudged from time. At first, Naomi thought they were love letters from her father, a man she had never known. But as she skimmed through the contents, her heart began to pound. The letters were not addressed to her father. They were from her mother, and they were written to Daniel. Confusion gripped her as she read the first letter. "Daniel, I can't keep this up much longer. It's getting harder to hide, harder to pretend. Every time I look into Naomi's eyes, I feel the weight of our secret crushing me. I love you, but I love my daughter too. We have to be careful." Naomi's hands trembled as she reached for another. "I'm scared. If she ever finds out, it will destroy her. She trusts us both. She loves us both. But this is bigger than either of us now." A sickening realization settled over Naomi like a dark cloud. These letters weren't just a mistake from the past. The dates spanned years, long before she and Daniel had married and long after. The most recent one was dated only 2 years ago. Her breath hitched. The betrayal wasn't just old wounds reopening. It was fresh, ongoing. Her mother and her husband had been lovers. For years. Even before Naomi married Daniel, even before she had their children, the two people she trusted the most had been deceiving her. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered, "I love you," from Daniel had been tainted by this secret life he had shared with her mother. A guttural sob escaped her lips as she stumbled backward, clutching the letters like they might disappear if she let go. Her mind raced with memories, her mother's lingering glances at Daniel, the way they always seemed to share unspoken words between them, the odd silences when she entered a room. How had she been so blind? Naomi felt the walls closing in. The air in the attic grew thick, suffocating. Betrayal coursed through her veins, a venom far more lethal than anything she had ever known. Her entire life was a lie. Her marriage was a lie. And there was only one way to make things right. Daniel had to die. Naomi didn't sleep that night. She sat in the darkened living room, gripping the letters, replaying every moment of her life with Daniel and her mother. The lies, the deception, the audacity of it all consumed her. She could hear his steady breathing from the bedroom upstairs, completely unaware that his wife was plotting his demise. But she wouldn't be reckless. She had to be smart. If she was going to do this, she needed to make sure that no one would ever suspect her. Naomi began her research. By morning, she had a plan, and Daniel Carter's fate was sealed. This is just the beginning. The betrayal has been uncovered, and the storm is about to descend. Naomi's actions will set off a chain of events that no one, least of all her, can control. Naomi didn't sleep that night. The weight of betrayal sat heavily on her chest, pressing down like an unbearable burden. She had uncovered the unthinkable, a sordid affair between her husband and her own mother, a betrayal that had lasted years. It wasn't a one-time mistake, an indiscretion born of a moment of weakness. No, this was something else, something far worse. They had built their love on a foundation of lies, and now, Naomi could feel the entire structure of her life crumbling. Rage, sorrow, and disbelief mixed into a deadly cocktail, making her nauseous. She gripped the old letters in her trembling hands, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. The words swam before her eyes. If she ever finds out, it will destroy her. They had been right about that. But Naomi wasn't just destroyed. She was ready to destroy in return. Naomi was not the type of woman to act on impulse. She had always been logical, rational, someone who prided herself on making calculated decisions. And this needed to be calculated. If she was going to kill her husband, she had to do it in a way that left no trace, no suspicion, no loose ends. She knew how these things worked. She had seen enough true crime documentaries to understand what detectives looked for. Motive? She had that in spades. But without a clear link to the crime, without evidence tying her to it, she could walk away clean. Her first thought was poison. It was simple, effective, and easy to obtain. But poison could be traced, and if Daniel's death seemed unnatural, an autopsy would be performed. No, she had to be smarter than that. An accident. That was the best option. Something that wouldn't make anyone look twice. But how? Car brakes? A fall down the stairs? Naomi spent hours researching, combing through forums, reading articles on undetectable murder methods. And then, as she sat in the dim glow of her laptop screen, she found it. A heart attack, induced by a carefully measured overdose of digitalis, a medication Daniel already took for mild heart issues. A slight increase in dosage could trigger fatal cardiac arrest, and if done correctly, it would be chalked up to natural causes. Her plan was set. Now all she had to do was wait. The morning of the murder was like any other. Naomi played her part well, acting like the loving wife, the doting mother. She kissed Daniel on the cheek as he sipped his coffee, chatted about weekend plans, smiled in all the right places. But inside, she was ice. That evening, she prepared his usual tea, the same chamomile blend he drank every night. But this time, she crushed the extra pills carefully, stirring the fine powder into the honey. She sat across from him, watching as he lifted the cup to his lips, took a sip, and then another. Her heart pounded. Would it work? Would he notice? But Daniel simply sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You always make the best tea, babe." Naomi smiled. Just my way of taking care of you. And then she waited. It didn't take long. Within an hour, Daniel began to complain of dizziness, clutching his chest. His breathing became labored. Panic flickered in his eyes as he tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Naomi rushed to his side, playing her role perfectly. She screamed, fumbled for her phone, called 911 with just the right amount of hysteria in her voice. My husband, he's not breathing. Please, send help. By the time paramedics arrived, Daniel was gone. The official cause? A sudden cardiac event. A tragic, unexpected death. No one questioned it. Naomi Carter was now a widow, and no one suspected a thing. Days passed. The house was filled with mourners, friends, and family coming to pay their respects. Naomi played the grieving wife well. She cried at the funeral, accepted condolences with trembling hands, clutched her children tightly as they sobbed into her dress. But inside, she was waiting for the right moment, because there was still one more person who needed to die. Patricia Williams had been careful. She had hidden the affair for years, burying her guilt beneath motherly love and affectionate smiles. But Naomi knew better now. She saw her mother for what she was, a woman who had betrayed her own daughter in the worst possible way. And Naomi couldn't let that go unpunished. The night before Patricia was supposed to come over for dinner, Naomi sat in the dark, planning. This time it had to be different. Another sudden health-related death would raise suspicions. No, this one had to be brutal, personal. Naomi decided she would use a knife. It was fitting. Cold steel for a cold heart. When Patricia arrived the next evening, Naomi greeted her with a warm smile, just as she always had. They sat together, had a drink, reminisced about Daniel. Naomi feigned sadness, let her mother comfort her, let her think she was still the naive daughter who trusted her. And then, when Patricia least expected it, Naomi struck. The knife plunged into her mother's chest with a sickening sound, the betrayal cutting both ways. Patricia gasped, eyes wide in shock, hands grasping at Naomi's arms. Why? She choked, blood spilling from her lips. Naomi leaned in close, her voice a whisper. Because you took everything from me. Patricia's body slumped to the floor, lifeless. Naomi stood over her, breathing heavily. The weight that had been suffocating her was gone. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. Naomi had been careful. She had wiped down the scene, staged it as a robbery gone wrong. She had even planted false evidence to lead detectives in the wrong direction. For days, it worked. No one suspected her. But there was one problem. Detective Marcus Hayes. A seasoned investigator, Hayes had a reputation for solving the unsolvable. And something about this case didn't sit right with him. First, a husband dies of a sudden heart attack. Then, weeks later, the widow's mother is murdered? It was too much of a coincidence. Hayes began digging, and as he did, Naomi started to unravel. The pressure was suffocating. The guilt, the fear, the knowledge that she had taken 2 lives. It consumed her. And then, one night, Naomi made a decision. She couldn't let them take her. She couldn't let them separate her from her kids. If she was caught, they would be orphans. So she planned one last act. One final step. She would take her children's lives. Then her own. But before she could follow through, Detective Hayes arrived at her doorstep. Naomi Carter, he said, his eyes locked onto hers. We need to talk. And at that moment, she knew it was over. Detective Marcus Hayes had seen his fair share of crimes, cold-blooded murders, crimes of passion, killings born out of desperation. But there was something about this case that gnawed at him, a gut feeling that wouldn't let go. 2 deaths in one family within weeks, one labeled a natural cause, the other a robbery gone wrong. It was too neat, too convenient. The morning after Patricia Williams' murder, Hayes stood in her dimly lit kitchen, examining the crime scene. Blood had dried in deep maroon pools on the white-tiled floor, the signs of struggle evident. The tipped-over chair, the shattered glass. But something was off. The scene looked staged. He had seen too many burglaries gone bad. and they were never this clean. Doesn't feel right? Hayes muttered under his breath. His partner, Detective Julia Morales, glanced up from her notes. You think this was personal? She asked. Hayes nodded. Robbers don't usually stab someone clean through the heart and then leave cash and valuables untouched. He turned toward the doorway. We need to take another look at Naomi Carter. Naomi had been expecting them. She had prepared for this moment, just as she had planned every step so far. She answered the door with tired, red-rimmed eyes, her face pale, her expression grief-stricken. Detective, she said, her voice shaky. Is there any news? Please tell me you've caught whoever did this. Hayes studied her, taking in every detail. The slight tremor in her hands. The way she clutched her robe tightly around herself, as if she were cold. The mask of grief perfectly placed. Mrs. Carter, we just have a few more questions about your mother's murder. Naomi nodded and stepped aside, letting them in. She led them to the living room, where the scent of lavender and vanilla drifted from a candle burning on the coffee table. A framed photo of Daniel and Patricia sat on the mantel, a carefully placed touch to remind anyone who visited of the losses she had suffered. I don't understand, Naomi whispered, wringing her hands. First my husband, now my mother. Who would do this? Hayes leaned forward slightly. That's what we're trying to figure out. Can you tell us again? What time did your mother arrive that night? Naomi took a steadying breath. Around 7:30. And you said she was in good spirits? Nothing seemed off. She shook her head. She was happy. We were reminiscing about Daniel, talking about the kids. Then I stepped into the kitchen for just a few minutes to get dessert. When I came back, she let her voice break, covering her face with her hands. She was just on the floor. There was blood everywhere. Hayes didn't react to the show of emotion. Instead, he asked, and you didn't hear anything? No struggle? Naomi looked up, her eyes glistening. I don't know. Maybe I did? Maybe I thought she knocked something over? It all happened so fast. Hayes exchanged a glance with Morales. He could feel it, the cracks forming in her story. While Naomi played the part of the grieving daughter, Hayes and Morales dug deeper. They pulled phone records, financial statements, surveillance footage. They interviewed neighbors, friends, colleagues. And with each passing day, Naomi's carefully constructed world started to crumble. The first red flag was Daniel Carter's medical records. A sudden cardiac arrest was plausible, but Hayes requested a deeper toxicology report. The results were troubling: high levels of digitalis, more than what would be prescribed for minor heart issues. Someone had poisoned him. Then came the security footage from a nearby store. The night of Patricia's murder, a hooded figure was seen tossing something into a dumpster 2 blocks away from Naomi's house. A search turned up a pair of gloves, black leather, with blood traces matching Patricia Williams. Forensic analysis revealed something even more damning: traces of Naomi's DNA inside the gloves. She's slipping, Morales said, shaking her head as she read the latest lab report. She thought she covered her tracks, but she's starting to make mistakes. Hayes exhaled sharply. She thought she was smarter than us. They always do. Naomi knew. She could feel it. The way people looked at her differently. The way the detectives kept coming back with more questions. The way the air around her felt heavy, suffocating. She wasn't safe anymore, and so she made her final decision. If she was going down, she wasn't going alone. Late that night, Naomi stood in the dimly lit hallway outside her children's bedrooms, a bottle of sleeping pills in one hand, a glass of water in the other. Her fingers trembled as she pushed open the door to her son's room. He was sleeping soundly, unaware of the darkness lurking just feet away. She hesitated, just for a moment. Then, a knock at the door. Naomi froze. Another knock, more insistent this time. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Slowly, she set the glass down and walked toward the front door. When she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. Detective Hayes. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice calm but firm. We need to talk. She tried to keep her voice steady. It's late, Detective. My children are sleeping. This won't take long. Naomi hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. Hayes didn't sit. He simply turned to face her, his eyes dark and knowing. "We got the toxicology report on your husband," he said, watching her reaction closely. "Turns out he didn't just have a heart attack. Someone poisoned him." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. "What? That's impossible." Hayes took another step forward. "We also found a pair of gloves. Blood from your mother. Your DNA inside." Naomi's vision blurred. The room spun. Hayes didn't stop. "You've been smart, Naomi. Careful. But not careful enough." For the first time in weeks, she felt the full weight of what she had done. The walls were closing in. There was no escape. And in that moment, Naomi Carter realized her story was over. Detective Marcus Hayes sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the evidence board covered in crime scene photos, timelines, and witness statements. Naomi Carter was a careful woman, too careful. But he had seen enough cases like this to know that even the smartest criminals eventually made a mistake. The problem was, Naomi had nearly covered her tracks too well. The gloves had been a breakthrough, but not the smoking gun they needed to make an arrest. Naomi's defense would argue that anyone could have planted them. The toxicology report was another piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't direct evidence that she had poisoned Daniel Carter. Hayes needed more. He needed something undeniable. Then an idea struck him. "Julia," he called out to his partner, "pull Naomi's financials again. Look for any out-of-the-ordinary purchases in the months leading up to Daniel's death." Detective Julia Morales nodded, grabbing her laptop. "You think she bought the poison? I think she bought something. If she's as meticulous as I believe, she planned every step of this." Minutes later, Morales' eyes widened. "Bingo!" She turned the screen toward Hayes. "A purchase from an online pharmaceutical store. A prescription for digitalis. And get this, delivered to a P.O. box registered under her maiden name." Hayes leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "That's it. That's the proof we need." But it wasn't over yet. They needed to get Naomi to slip up. And for that, they had to push her to the edge. Naomi Carter sat at her kitchen table, her mind racing. The world was closing in on her. She could feel it. The detectives weren't backing off, and the weight of her mother's death was suffocating. The grief she had faked for weeks now sat on her chest like an iron weight. She had planned so perfectly. Every detail, every alibi. She had killed Daniel without raising suspicion. It had taken days before anyone even thought of testing for poison. With her mother, she had been more reckless, but it had still been clean, quick, necessary. Now they were watching her. She had seen the unmarked car parked down the street. The detectives' repeated visits. Their questions, each one tightening the noose around her neck. Her hands shook as she reached for her glass of wine. She had to be strong. Then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You can't hide forever. They know." Her stomach clenched. She gripped the phone, her breath shallow. Who was this? Someone playing games? Or had she missed something? Her mind raced. Could it be the detectives? Could it be someone who knew what she had done? She needed to act fast. Naomi made a decision. She needed to get rid of anything that could link her to the crimes. She had already disposed of Daniel's medication bottles. But had she been thorough enough? The gloves were already found. But there were emails, records, things she had overlooked. She grabbed her laptop and started deleting files, clearing search histories, wiping emails. She worked feverishly, desperate to erase the trail before it was too late. Then, a knock at the door. Her breath caught in her throat. She closed the laptop, smoothing her shaking hands over her dress before heading toward the door. When she opened it, Detective Hayes stood there, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "we need you to come with us." Naomi forced a confused expression. "What's this about?" Hayes held up a folder. "We have new evidence. We need to ask you a few more questions at the station." She hesitated. If she refused, it would make her look guilty. If she went, she needed to stay calm. She nodded. "Of course. Let me get my coat." As she turned, Hayes' voice stopped her. Actually, we'll need your laptop too. Naomi froze. The walls were truly closing in. At the station, Naomi sat in the cold interrogation room, her hands folded neatly on the table. She was determined to hold her composure. Detective Hayes and Morales sat across from her, silent for a moment. Then Hayes pushed a photo toward her. It was the online prescription order. Her name, her P.O. box, the date. You bought Digitalis, Naomi. She kept her face neutral. I had heart issues. Hayes nodded, playing along. Of course. But then explain this. Another paper. The toxicology report showing Daniel's cause of death. Your husband died of an overdose of the exact medication you ordered. That's not a coincidence. Naomi swallowed. I don't know what you mean. Hayes leaned forward. You poisoned your husband, didn't you? You wanted him dead. And when your mother started getting suspicious, you killed her too. Naomi shook her head. This is insane. Hayes placed another file on the table. We also have surveillance footage of someone dumping gloves with your mother's blood. And guess what? The DNA inside matches yours. Naomi's breathing turned shallow. She could feel it now, the loss of control. Her perfectly constructed reality was falling apart. Then Hayes delivered the final blow. We know about the affair. Naomi's body went rigid. What? We know your mother and Daniel were involved before you ever married him. We know the truth, Naomi. Tears welled in her eyes. The betrayal, the rage, it had all led to this. You don't understand, she whispered. Hayes sat back, folding his arms. Then make us understand. For the first time, Naomi Carter had no plan, no perfect lie, and so she told the truth. Naomi Carter was no longer the picture of a grieving widow. The shattered mask she had carefully constructed for weeks now lay in tatters. Inside, the walls were closing in, suffocating her with every passing minute. She could feel it. Every decision she made, every step she took, was now a trap. There was no way out. The detectives had cornered her. The evidence was damning, and the truth that she had tried so desperately to bury was finally rising to the surface. That night, after Hayes had left her home, Naomi had retreated to the solitude of her bedroom, a dark cloud of dread hovering over her. The small, dimly lit room felt colder than usual, and despite the thick blankets on her bed, she couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. Her children were asleep, unaware of the unraveling storm, and yet Naomi knew that she was on the verge of losing everything. The events of the past few weeks had started to blur together. Her husband Daniel's mysterious death, the sudden and brutal murder of her mother, Patricia, the carefully executed lies she had woven into her narrative, the countless hours of pretending to be the innocent, grieving widow and daughter. Now it all seemed like a distant memory. None of it mattered. The truth was coming for her. There was no escape from it. As Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling, her mind replayed the series of events that had brought her here. The toxicology reports that proved Daniel's heart attack had been no accident. The gloves, stained with her mother's blood, found discarded in a nearby dumpster. And now Detective Hayes knew. She had poisoned her husband, but it was the murder of her mother that had pushed everything into motion. That was her breaking point, the final step in a twisted dance that she could never take back. She had done it all masterfully. She had crafted her alibi with precision, playing the role of the heartbroken wife and daughter. No one suspected a thing, not at first, but then the cracks began to show. Every lie, every misstep, had been uncovered piece by piece until the detectives were on her heels. Now the noose was tightening. In the silence of her room, Naomi could hear the faint sound of her children's breathing from the adjacent rooms. Her heart ached at the thought of them. They were her world, her reason for doing everything she had done. But as the detectives moved closer to the truth, Naomi knew that she would have to make a choice. There were no second chances. The doorbell rang, pulling Naomi from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. Slowly, she stood and made her way downstairs. As she approached the door, Naomi's fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. The fear of being caught, of losing everything, gripped her tightly. She opened the door, and there stood Detective Marcus Hayes, his face as inscrutable as ever, but with a new intensity in his eyes. "I told you it wouldn't take long, Mrs. Carter," Hayes said, his voice calm but with an edge she couldn't ignore. Naomi swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Detective, what are you doing here? It's late." "I know," Hayes replied, stepping past her into the house without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." She stepped back, her pulse racing, as he moved deeper into the living room. Hayes had been relentless, always one step ahead, always pushing further into her life. The walls around her had already crumbled, but now, in the presence of the detective, they were all but gone. "Please, Detective, I don't know what else you want from me," Naomi stammered, her voice shaky. Hayes turned to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't know? You don't know what else I want." He took a step closer, his presence commanding. "The truth, Mrs. Carter. I want the truth." Naomi felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been so careful, so precise. How had he uncovered it all? How had he gotten so close? "Do you know what it feels like to be caught in a lie so big you can't escape it?" Hayes asked, his voice low, almost like he was speaking to himself. Naomi remained silent, but inside, her mind was racing. "I've seen it before, Naomi. The guilt, the panic, the slow unraveling. And it's happening right in front of me. I didn't—" Naomi began, but her voice faltered as she tried to form the words that could explain everything. There were no words, no excuses. "I know you didn't do it alone," Hayes continued, his eyes dark with understanding. "You were pushed. I can see it in your eyes. But that doesn't change the fact that you killed your husband. And your mother. You made a choice." Naomi's legs felt weak beneath her, and she sank into the nearest chair, her mind clouded with conflicting thoughts. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I didn't want it to go this far." Hayes crossed his arms, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Then why poison your husband? Why kill your mother?" Tears welled up in Naomi's eyes as the weight of it all hit her once again. She thought she could keep her composure, keep her children's lives intact, but the reality of what she had done was impossible to ignore now. "I couldn't," she started, but her voice broke as she spoke. "I couldn't live with the truth anymore. Not after everything. The affair, the lies. I couldn't stand the thought of living in a world where I wasn't enough. Where everything we had, everything he said he loved about me, was a lie." Hayes didn't flinch. His eyes softened just for a moment, as if he understood. But then he asked, "How long did it go on, Naomi? How long did you know?" "I didn't," Naomi began, but the words caught in her throat. "I found out just before our wedding, but I loved him. I thought I could ignore it. I thought I could move on, but it ate away at me slowly. And then when he died, when I saw my mother's betrayal—" She stopped, unable to continue. Hayes waited in silence, allowing her the space to speak, knowing full well that this was the breaking point. The moment where Naomi would either admit everything or retreat back into her own lies. "I couldn't take it anymore. I had to stop it," Naomi finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I had to make sure the truth was buried forever. I couldn't live with the shame. And if I was going down, I wasn't going alone." The room fell silent as Naomi finally acknowledged the depth of her actions, the extent of the betrayal she had orchestrated. Detective Hayes had her now, completely. For Naomi, there was no turning back. The truth had been laid bare, and the consequences were inevitable. The emotional weight of her decisions, her grief, her desire for revenge, and her fear of being exposed had led her to this moment. And in that moment, Naomi realized that the consequences of betrayal were far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. Detective Marcus Hayes sat in his dimly lit office, his fingers drumming absently on the cold surface of his desk. The room, heavy with the scent of old coffee and case files, felt more oppressive than usual. He had spent the last few weeks chasing Naomi Carter's lies, uncovering her manipulations, and piecing together the twisted tale of betrayal and murder she had carefully woven. But as the investigation progressed, he realized there was something even darker beneath the surface. Something that wasn't just about vengeance or greed. It was about a woman desperate to keep control over a life that had slipped through her fingers. Now, Naomi's confession weighed heavily on him. The final details had emerged, but they had come at a price. The more he uncovered, the more he felt the emotional toll of this case. Something about it felt personal, almost too personal. Naomi Carter had been a wife, a mother, and a daughter just like anyone else. But the lies she told, the lives she destroyed, and the unthinkable choices she made to maintain a facade, those things haunted him. There was no easy way out of this, not for her, not for him. The case had taken its toll on him. His instincts told him there was more to the story. Naomi's confession seemed too clean, too rehearsed. He didn't believe she had come forward voluntarily. The confession was the result of pressure. And it wasn't over yet. Naomi had been charged, and the trial was just around the corner. But there was something else nagging at Hayes's mind. Something unresolved. He couldn't shake the feeling that Naomi hadn't told them everything. There were still too many gaps, too many unanswered questions. Hayes couldn't stop thinking about the toxicology reports, the gloves with Naomi's DNA, the details of her husband's sudden death. Yes, it had all pointed to her. But there was an underlying unease that Hayes couldn't ignore. Something was off. "Julia," Hayes said one morning as he stared at a new report that had come across his desk. Detective Julia Morales, his partner, leaned in from across the room. Her brow furrowed as she glanced at the paper. "Yeah, what's up?" she asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. Hayes rubbed his eyes, exhausted. "Something doesn't sit right with me about this whole case. Naomi, she confessed, right? But it just feels like we're missing something important. Look at this." He slid the report across the table, his voice low. Julia glanced over the details. "It's the coroner's report from Patricia Williams's death. You're saying we missed something?" "No," Hayes replied, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's what they didn't mention in the report. There's a discrepancy in the timeline. According to Naomi's statement, Patricia was supposed to arrive at 7:30 p.m., but the time of death, according to the coroner, was much earlier than that. It doesn't add up." Julia stared at him for a moment before processing the information. "You think she was already dead when Naomi claimed to have seen her?" "I think Naomi's timeline is a lie," Hayes said, his voice hardening. "If Patricia was already dead when Naomi said she found her, then she would have had time to stage the crime scene. The bloodstains on the floor, the shattered glass, the tipped-over chair. It all looked like a setup." Julia nodded, slowly piecing it together. She could have been lying about the entire evening, including what happened in the kitchen. Hayes clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing. Exactly. Naomi had too much time to plan. She staged it to look like a robbery gone wrong. But I think it was a cold, calculated murder. Which would explain why she was so convincing, Julia said, her voice thoughtful. She had all the details memorized, the alibi, the timing, the emotions. But if she was lying about the timeline, then what else has she lied about? Hayes had learned a long time ago that confessions weren't always what they seemed. Naomi's confession about her husband's poisoning had felt too rehearsed, too perfect. It wasn't the confession of a woman backed into a corner. It was the confession of someone who thought they could control the narrative, someone who believed they could manipulate the truth. He couldn't stop wondering if Naomi had killed Patricia first, not after, as she had claimed. Patricia's death had been swift, almost professional. But Daniel's death? That had been far more drawn out, a slow poisoning over time. If Naomi had been covering up Patricia's murder, she would have needed to get rid of her husband next. After all, he had been the most dangerous threat to her. It made sense. Patricia's betrayal was the final straw, the breaking point that had pushed Naomi to take control of her life in the most devastating way. But the way she had executed everything with such cold precision, it unsettled him. Hayes had spent long nights at the station, combing through records, double-checking evidence, speaking to experts in toxicology and forensic psychology. He spoke to every person Naomi had interacted with over the years, and the more he learned, the more layers of Naomi Carter's life began to peel away. He learned about the affair between Naomi's mother, Patricia, and Naomi's husband, Daniel. He had known there had been something between them, but the depth of the betrayal hit him hard. Patricia and Daniel's relationship hadn't been a brief fling or a mistake. It had been a secret that had spanned years, long before Naomi and Daniel had even met. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a web of lies that had stretched into Naomi's very marriage, and she had never known. But when she did find out, that was when the real planning began. Naomi hadn't just been a victim of betrayal. She had decided to take control of the narrative, to kill the ones who had hurt her. In her mind, it wasn't just about revenge, it was about self-preservation. She had convinced herself that she couldn't live in a world where the people she trusted most had kept such dark secrets from her. Hayes knew he had to confront Naomi again. He couldn't rest until he understood everything, the full story, the real motivation. She had been caught, but not completely. There were still holes in her confession, and Hayes couldn't stop thinking about those gaps. Late one evening, as Hayes was preparing to leave for the night, his phone rang. It was Julia. "Hayes, you need to get over here. Now, we've got something big." Hayes grabbed his coat and headed out. It was a 5-minute drive to the station, but it felt like hours. When he walked into the conference room, Julia was already there, her face grim. She handed him a file. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tight. Inside the file was an envelope with Naomi's handwriting on it. An unsent letter. A confession, but not the one they had heard before. This one was raw, filled with guilt, anguish, and a desperate need for absolution. It was addressed to Naomi's children. Hayes sat down, opening the letter slowly. The words that followed made his stomach turn. "I never wanted this life for you," the letter began. "But I had no choice. I thought I was protecting you, but in the end, I failed. I failed you all." As he read on, Hayes realized that Naomi wasn't just confessing to the crimes. She was justifying them. She believed she had been forced into this situation, that she was the only one who could end the cycle of lies and betrayal. Naomi had been playing a dangerous game, one where she had convinced herself that the only way to survive was to destroy everything that threatened her. But Hayes knew better. There was always another way. Now, as the case was closing in, Naomi had to face the consequences of her actions. There was no escaping it, not this time. The courtroom was quiet, save for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional cough from the audience. Detective Marcus Hayes stood near the back, watching Naomi Carter as she sat at the defense table, her eyes dull, hollow. She had aged 10 years in the last few months, the stress of the trial and the weight of her actions catching up with her. She had once been a woman who appeared to have it all. A perfect family, a perfect life. Now, she was a woman whose life had unraveled in the most unimaginable way. The person who had betrayed everyone, herself included, was about to face the consequences. The air in the courtroom felt thick with tension. Naomi's trial had captured the attention of the media. Her story of love, betrayal, and murder plastered on every news outlet. The woman who had once appeared so composed and perfect now stood at the center of a tragic tale. Her defense team had tried everything they could to paint her as a victim of circumstance, someone pushed to the edge by the betrayal of the two people she had trusted most. But Detective Hayes knew better. Naomi had been one of those rare cases that stayed with you long after the investigation ended. She wasn't some faceless criminal to him. She was a mother, a wife, a daughter, all roles she had played with an almost alarming degree of perfection. It was that perfection that had made her so dangerous, so unpredictable. The woman who could smile through a betrayal and hold everything together, only to shatter it all in a moment of madness. Now, as Hayes watched her sit quietly, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Not for her, but for the lives she had destroyed. For the children who had lost both their parents. For the family members who were left to pick up the pieces of a broken legacy. For Patricia, who had never had the chance to make amends. And for Daniel, who had been poisoned by the very person who had promised to love him. It was impossible to ignore the weight of the situation. Naomi hadn't just taken 2 lives. She had stolen something much more profound: trust. The trust between a mother and daughter, a husband and wife, and most tragically, the trust between a mother and her children. It was those broken bonds that haunted Hayes as he reflected on everything that had led them to this moment. Naomi's defense lawyer had called several witnesses, all of whom spoke about Naomi's good character, her devotion to her family, and her tragic loss. They had painted her as a woman driven to madness by the betrayal of her husband and mother. But Hayes knew better than to be swayed by such easy narratives. Naomi wasn't the victim. She had been the orchestrator. When it was time for the prosecution to make its case, Hayes was called to the stand. His testimony was straightforward: facts, evidence, timelines. But when he spoke of the poison that had taken Daniel's life, of the gloves that had contained Naomi's DNA, and of the meticulous way in which Naomi had staged her mother's death, the truth became undeniable. There was no escaping the cold reality of what Naomi had done. As Hayes recounted the investigation, he could see the emotional toll it had taken on the courtroom. Some people had come to see Naomi as a victim of circumstance, but Hayes wasn't about to let her off the hook. His job wasn't to sympathize with her. It was to reveal the truth. The truth, he knew, was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Naomi wasn't just a woman seeking revenge. She was a woman desperate to regain control of a life that had spiraled out of her hands. She had been betrayed by the two people she trusted most, and in the end, she had convinced herself that taking their lives was the only way to preserve the world she had built. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was far more damning. As the trial moved forward, the final pieces of Naomi's twisted plan began to come to light. The affair between Daniel and Patricia wasn't just a secret. It was the catalyst for Naomi's destruction. It had begun years before, during their marriage, and had been the deep, dark undercurrent in Naomi's life. The one thing that had poisoned everything she thought she knew about the people she loved. But Naomi had never suspected it. She had built her life around the belief that her family was perfect, that her marriage was strong, that her mother was her confidant. And when she discovered the truth, it shattered everything. The affair wasn't just about betrayal, it was about Naomi's sense of identity. Who was she if her mother and her husband, the two people who should have been closest to her, had been living a lie for so long? How could she go on trusting anyone if the foundation of her world was built on secrets? The affair was the final straw. The poison, the gloves, the staged crime scene. It was all part of Naomi's desperate attempt to regain control. But control, she had learned too late, was an illusion. Naomi sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling in her lap, as the closing arguments were made. She had been through hell. The weight of her actions, the pain of losing everything, her family, her freedom, her sense of self, was almost too much to bear. As the judge read the verdict, she barely registered the words. Guilty. The courtroom seemed to close in around her. The reality of the situation hit her in waves. She had killed the two people who had been closest to her, and in the process, she had destroyed the one thing that had kept her going, the hope that everything could still be fixed, the hope that there was a way to heal the wounds, to make things right. But it was over now. The gavel came down, the finality of it ringing through the room. Naomi Carter was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The families of Daniel and Patricia had their chance to speak, to share their pain and anger. And as the courtroom emptied, Detective Hayes found himself standing in the hallway, the weight of the case finally catching up with him. Naomi Carter had destroyed her life, but she hadn't just destroyed her own life. She had destroyed the lives of everyone around her. The family she had broken, the people she had betrayed, and the children who had been left in the wake of her choices. As Hayes walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling of hopelessness that had settled in his chest. Naomi Carter's story wasn't just one of murder. It was a story of a woman pushed too far by betrayal, a woman who had reached the breaking point and never looked back. The saddest part of it all was that Naomi hadn't just killed two people. She had killed everything she had once believed in. And in the end, there was no coming back from that. The prison walls loomed over Naomi Carter, casting long, silent shadows that stretched like fingers across the cold concrete floors. The once perfect life she had so carefully crafted now seemed like a distant memory, one that felt foreign to her. Her days were a blur of routine and reflection, a slow, painful march through the repercussions of her own making. Naomi had spent weeks, months even, trying to come to terms with what had happened. The events she had set in motion, the people she had destroyed, and the role she had played in everything that had unraveled. In the sterile, dimly lit confines of her cell, Naomi often found herself staring at the walls, her mind racing through the years she had spent building her life with Daniel, her husband, and Patricia, her mother. The deception, the betrayal, her mind churned with the sharp, jagged edges of those truths. How had it come to this? How had she fallen so far? And how, in the face of such overwhelming loss, had she convinced herself that murder was the only way out? The days were long, the nights even longer. There was no escape. The only company she had was the hollow silence that filled her cell, broken only by the occasional voices of fellow inmates or the distant clang of metal doors. Naomi had come to understand, in the most painful way, that her actions had not only destroyed the lives of those closest to her, they had also shattered her own. But it was the haunting memory of her children that kept Naomi awake at night. Her 2 young children had been taken into protective custody after Naomi's arrest. They were the only part of her life that hadn't been tainted by the chaos she had caused. Naomi had been their mother, the one who had held them when they cried, the one who had kissed their foreheads before bed, the one who had promised them a future of safety and love. Now, they were left without that promise. Naomi had been locked in a cycle of guilt and regret, each day more suffocating than the last. She could still remember the way her son's face had looked when he was taken from her. The confusion in his eyes as the social worker explained that he was going to stay with relatives for a while. Naomi had wanted to scream, to hold him close and beg for forgiveness, but the words had gotten stuck in her throat. She had no right to ask for forgiveness, not from her children, not from anyone. The thought of her daughter, too, caused her chest to tighten with unbearable grief. What kind of mother had she been? She had taken 2 lives: Daniel's, the man she had promised to love forever, and Patricia's, her own mother. But it was the lives of her children, the innocent lives she had brought into this world, that she mourned the most. They would grow up without the love and protection they deserved. They would have to face the world without the woman who should have been their shield. In the silence of her prison cell, Naomi had tried to make sense of it all. She often thought back to the moment she had made her final decision, the moment when everything had changed, the moment she had stood at the edge of the abyss, holding the pills in her hand, contemplating ending it all. She could still feel the cold weight of the bottle, the way her fingers had trembled as she had stared at her children, sound asleep in their rooms. But just as she was about to make the final, irreversible choice, the knock on the door had come. It had been Detective Hayes, the man who had cracked open her perfect world. In hindsight, Naomi realized it was almost fitting that he had been the one to confront her in that moment of weakness. Hayes had been the one to dismantle her lies, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the ugly truth. As he had stood in her doorway, telling her that the investigation into Daniel's death had uncovered the truth of the poisoning, Naomi had felt her world crumble beneath her. The walls had closed in, and she had known in that instant that there was no turning back. The truth was out, and there was no escaping the consequences. The days that followed had been a blur of interrogations, police interviews, and the slow process of her unraveling. Naomi's defense team had tried to argue that she had been a victim of her circumstances, that she had been pushed to the edge by betrayal and heartbreak. But Naomi knew better than anyone that those were just excuses. No one had forced her to take that step. No one had made her murder her husband and mother. She had chosen that path, and now she had to live with the consequences. It wasn't just the legal ramifications that haunted her. It was the way the truth had torn through the very fabric of her identity. She had spent years constructing a version of herself that was perfect, one that fit the ideal of a loving wife, a caring daughter, a devoted mother. But when the truth had been exposed, there was no hiding behind the facade anymore. Naomi had been nothing more than a woman consumed by jealousy, hurt, and betrayal. The hardest part, though, was the realization that she had betrayed herself. Naomi had believed in the lie that she was in control. She had believed that her love for Daniel was enough to keep him faithful, that her devotion to her family was enough to ward off any temptation. But in the end, it was all a lie. Daniel had betrayed her long before she ever suspected, and Patricia, her mother, had been the one to help him do it. Their affair had been the thing that had unraveled Naomi's world, the thing that had pushed her to a place she never imagined she would go. Now, Naomi was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, a life that could never be repaired. She had lost her family, her freedom, and her sense of self. She had been consumed by the very betrayal she had tried so hard to ignore. And as she sat in her cell, Naomi could do nothing but reflect on the brokenness she had created, the wreckage she had left behind. The trial was over, and the verdict had been delivered. Naomi had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no coming back from this, no chance for redemption. The legal system had done its job, but Naomi knew that the real punishment was yet to come. Every day in prison was a reminder of the pain she had caused. There were no easy answers, no simple fixes. She would spend the rest of her life paying for what she had done, and in the quiet of her cell, she would reflect on the woman she had once been and the monster she had become. But even in the darkest moments, Naomi couldn't shake the thought of her children. What would they think of her? What kind of legacy had she left for them? The weight of that question gnawed at her day and night, the uncertainty of her children's future a constant presence in her mind. As the months passed, Naomi came to understand that she could never undo the damage she had done. There was no coming back from the choices she had made. And yet, she found herself thinking of one last thing: redemption. Was it possible to find redemption in the wake of such betrayal? Was it possible to reclaim something of herself in the midst of all the destruction? For Naomi, the answer was unclear. What was clear, however, was that she would never be free of the consequences of her actions. The road ahead was long, and it was a road she would have to walk alone. Naomi Carter sat in the small, dimly lit room, her hands nervously clasped together in her lap. The prison walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with each passing moment. Time had become a meaningless concept here. Days bled into one another, with nothing to mark their passage except the deepening shadows in her soul. She had never imagined that her life would come to this: the hollow silence of a prison cell, the weight of guilt heavier than any physical chains. Yet, there was one thing that haunted Naomi more than the prison bars that confined her. It was the thought of her children, the two innocent lives she had brought into the world, only to have them ripped away from her. The ache in her chest was unrelenting, a constant reminder of the choices she had made. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many trials she endured, Naomi knew that she would never be free of the pain she had inflicted upon herself. Her son, Aaron, had just turned 6 when she was arrested. He had always been her protector, the one who kept her grounded even when everything around them seemed to fall apart. Naomi could still see his bright, curious eyes as he had looked up at her the day he was taken into protective custody, not understanding why his mother was being led away in handcuffs. He had called out to her, reaching for her, his little arms stretched wide, his voice trembling with fear. But Naomi had been too broken to reach back. Her daughter, Layla, had been only 4 years old when Naomi's world came crashing down. Layla had always been a quiet child, shy and sweet, with a love for books and stuffed animals. Naomi's heart broke at the thought of her daughter growing up without her, without the comfort of her mother's embrace, without the chance to learn and grow together. The bond they had shared, the love Naomi had given them both, now seemed so distant and unreachable. And it was all Naomi's fault. The guilt consumed her, washed over her like a relentless tide that would never recede. Naomi had convinced herself for so long that she was doing what was necessary, that she was justified in her actions. But now, with the passage of time and the clarity of hindsight, she understood that there was no justification. There was no reason good enough to explain away the deaths of Daniel and Patricia. There was no reason to kill the people who had once been the most important in her life. Naomi's relationship with Daniel had been complicated from the start. They had met in college, too young, hopeful students who had fallen in love under the bright lights of their future. She had been the perfect wife, supportive, loving, and loyal. But Daniel, her husband, had been the one person she could never truly trust. His betrayal had cut her deep, deeper than she could have ever anticipated. She had always felt a sense of inadequacy, a fear that she wasn't enough for him. But when she discovered the truth, that he had been having an affair with her own mother for years, Naomi's world had shattered. The affair had started before their marriage, a dark secret that Daniel and Patricia had kept hidden from her for years. They had continued to see each other even after Naomi and Daniel had gotten married, even after the birth of their children. Naomi had never suspected anything, too caught up in the illusion of happiness they had built together. But when the truth came to light, Naomi's mind had exploded with rage and betrayal. She had felt like a fool. Her whole life had been a lie. In that moment, Naomi knew she had to do something. She couldn't confront her mother, couldn't confront Daniel. She had to make them pay. And so, she had taken matters into her own hands, methodically planning the murders of both of them. But now, sitting alone in her cell, Naomi could see the truth of what she had done. She had let her pain consume her. She had allowed the betrayal to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. And now, she had nothing left but the darkness. The trial had been a public spectacle. The media had descended on the case with a ferocity Naomi had never expected. Her family, what remained of it, was torn apart, the court hearings a reminder of just how far she had fallen. Naomi had been forced to relive every moment of her life with Daniel and Patricia. She had heard the testimonies from the people who had known her, seen the shock and disbelief in their eyes as they learned the depths of her deception. The courtroom was silent as Naomi's defense attorney had tried to paint a picture of a woman driven to the edge by betrayal, a woman who had acted out of a desperate need to protect her family. But Naomi knew that the defense had been weak, a flimsy excuse for what she had done. She wasn't a victim, she was a murderer. The prosecution had been relentless, presenting the evidence that Naomi had tried so hard to conceal. The toxicology report on Daniel's body had revealed the poison that had taken his life, digitalis, a drug she had carefully administered, making sure it wouldn't be detected until it was too late. And the forensic evidence from Patricia's murder had been damning. Blood found in Naomi's gloves, her DNA all over the crime scene. At the sentencing, Naomi had been prepared for the worst. She knew that the law could not overlook her crimes. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, that had been the verdict. Naomi had expected nothing less. Now, as she sat alone in her cell, Naomi understood the true weight of her actions. The trials of the past few months had been nothing compared to the internal struggle she faced each day. She had killed two people who had once been the most important to her. And even now, as she reflected on her decisions, Naomi couldn't escape the deep regret that gnawed at her soul. What would her children think of her when they were older? Would they ever understand what had driven her to make the decisions she had made? Would they ever forgive her for taking their father and grandmother from them? Naomi's heart ached at the thought of them growing up without her. She had destroyed their lives just as surely as she had destroyed her own. But in the midst of the despair, there was a flicker of something else. A small, fragile hope. Naomi had realized that there was still a chance for redemption, albeit a distant one. It would not come easily, and it would not come soon. But there was something she could do to atone for her sins. She could spend her life making amends, trying to do something, anything, to make up for the pain she had caused. She had written letters to her children, though she knew they would never reach them until they were much older. She had told them the truth, apologized for everything she had done. And while she didn't expect forgiveness, she didn't even know if forgiveness was possible. She needed to tell them. She needed them to know that she had loved them more than anything in the world, even if she had failed them in the worst way possible. Naomi had begun attending therapy sessions, working through the deep, festering wounds that had caused her to lash out so violently. She had started to understand the roots of her anger and jealousy, the emotional scars she had carried from childhood, the pain of betrayal that had clouded her judgment. She had started to acknowledge that no amount of pain could justify what she had done. But whether she could ever truly forgive herself, whether anyone could ever forgive her, remained to be seen. The prison was cold, not just in temperature, but in feeling, in the way it seeped into Naomi Carter's bones, wrapping around her like an unwanted embrace. She had been here long enough to recognize the distinct sounds of metal doors slamming shut, the murmurs of other inmates, the sharp voices of guards cutting through the silence like blades. Yet, no matter how much time passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. Not because she was innocent, she wasn't, but because she had never truly imagined her life would end up like this. It had been over a year since the trial, over a year since she had stood in that courtroom, listening as the prosecution dismantled her life piece by piece. Over a year since she had seen her children's faces in the arms of their temporary guardians, too young to understand what had happened, too young to comprehend the gravity of her crimes. Naomi had told herself she was prepared for prison. She had known there was no escape, no last-minute revelation that would spare her from the punishment she deserved. But nothing, no amount of imagining, could have prepared her for the crushing loneliness, the way time stretched on endlessly with nothing to break its suffocating grip. She had tried to stay strong in the beginning, holding onto the remnants of the woman she once was. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the weight of her choices settled deeper into her soul. And then, one day, she received a letter. Naomi had stopped expecting mail months ago. The only letters she had received in the beginning had been from her lawyers, legal jargon she barely had the energy to read. There had been no letters from friends, no desperate pleas from distant relatives to explain why she had done what she had done. Her world had become silent. So when the guard called her name and slid an envelope through the slot of her cell, she hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting was familiar, but for a moment, she couldn't place it. Then her heart clenched as realization set in. It was from Aaron. Her hands trembled as she tore open the envelope, unfolding the lined paper with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Her son's words were simple, written in the unsteady hand of a child still learning to shape letters correctly. But each sentence hit her like a punch to the gut. "Mom, I miss you. I don't understand why you did what you did. Dad is gone. Grandma is gone. But you're still here. Why did you do it? I don't know if I'll ever understand, but I wanted to write to you anyway. Layla doesn't talk about you much. I think she's mad. I don't know how to feel. I just miss you. Aaron." Tears blurred Naomi's vision. She read the letter over and over, her fingers pressing into the paper as if she could somehow hold onto the words, as if they could fill the void inside her. She had always known that one day, her children would question what she had done. But reading Aaron's confusion in his own words made it real in a way nothing else had. She had stolen their future. She had taken away their father and grandmother. But worse than that, she had shattered their sense of safety. Naomi had convinced herself that her actions were necessary, that she had no choice. But how could she ever explain that to a child? How could she make him understand when she barely understood herself? She wanted to write back. She wanted to tell Aaron everything, to pour out her heart and beg for his forgiveness. But what could she possibly say that would make a difference? What words could undo what had been done? Naomi folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest before tucking it away under her pillow. It was the only piece of her old life she had left, and she would protect it with everything she had. Weeks passed after the letter arrived, and Naomi found herself living in a haze. She replayed Aaron's words in her mind constantly, dissecting each sentence, searching for meaning in his childlike phrasing. The loneliness felt sharper now, more unbearable. She had done everything for her children, hadn't she? That's what she had told herself. But Aaron's words made her question everything. Then, one morning, the guards informed her that she had a visitor. Her heart pounded as she followed them down the long, sterile hallway to the visitation area. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who would come to see her after all this time? When she entered the room, she froze. Sitting at the table, his small hands folded neatly in front of him, was Aaron. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. He was taller than she remembered, his features sharper, more mature. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had always mirrored hers, were filled with something she couldn't quite name. Pain? Anger? A longing for answers? She swallowed the lump in her throat and slowly took a seat across from him. The thick glass separated them, a painful reminder of the life she had lost. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Aaron stared at her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Why did you do it?" Naomi's heart shattered. She had prepared for many questions, but not this one. Not so directly, not so soon. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she answer that? How could she explain something so monstrous to a child? "Aaron?" She reached for the phone on her side of the glass, and after a moment, he hesitantly picked up the receiver on his side. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes." His face remained unreadable. "Did you love Dad?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Yes, I did. More than anything." "Then why?" Naomi inhaled shakily. "Because I was angry. Because I was hurt. And I lost control." Aaron's small fingers tightened around the phone. "Did you ever love Grandma?" Naomi let out a quiet sob. "I thought I did. But then I found out things that hurt me. And I didn't know how to handle it." Silence stretched between them. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Aaron finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi's chest constricted, but she nodded. "I understand." Aaron glanced down, then back up at her. "But I miss you." Naomi let out a broken sob, pressing her fingers against the glass as if she could somehow touch him, as if she could somehow reach across the barrier between them. "I miss you too, baby. I miss you so much." They sat there in silence, staring at each other across the glass. A mother and son separated by fate, by choices, by the unforgiving weight of the past. Naomi knew she could never undo what she had done. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir in her chest. Hope.